Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the fourth episode and our book review of The Vampire, where my friend Leonora and I read Interview with the Vampire bit by bit, bite by bite, and then come on here and talk about what we read. So, good evening, Leonora.
Hello, I am sick.
Yes, Leonora is down with the sickness, so her voice might be a bit off, and she might have to mute herself occasionally while she coughs, or she might cough on the air as a special gift to all of you. It's entirely possible, maybe. But they're vampire coughs, so they're special.
Yes.
And good evening to those of you who have joined us this evening. Kiever Dam, Noah Asensio, happy birthday again to you, Noah. And Mike Savage, Blarg. Also, at the top of the chat box, for those of you listening in the background or in the future, there is a link to a GoFundMe for our friend's friend, Tracy, friend of Twisted Skipster, who needs a little help with some bills and real-life stuff. If you have a couple of bucks to spare, please consider donating there. If you can't donate, that's fine, but if you can, share that out on social media, that would also be appreciated. So, for our reading this week was in the book what is called Part 2, because Part 1 was made up of multiple sections, let's say, and then it all stops right in the middle, and then there's a Part 2, and Part 2 is only about 40 some odd pages, so it's relatively brief, so we decided to do that in its entirety for this week's reading assignment. And let's talk about it, because a lot of stuff happens, but not a lot of things occur at the same time in this part. And none of the events, except in the most like hand-wavy of ways, are depicted in the film. So this is all new material and new territory, at least for me, because as far like I've said before, as far as I can recall, I've never actually read this book in its entirety. So what we have at the beginning of Part 2 is after having defeated, seemingly, Lestat and Lestat's erstwhile child, the musician, and then fleeing New Orleans after lighting the place on fire and getting on the ship, the Mariana. Louis and Claudia are off to the deepest, darkest parts of Eastern Europe, apparently. And so the first section or so deals with Claudia and Louis on the boat. On a boat. Everybody look at them. They're sailing on a boat. And as far as I can recall, most of it was the two of them whining over the possibility that Lestat might not actually be dead, like dead. And also, so part of the frustration for me reading this was, okay, we have a scene now where you have two vampires living on what is effectively a cruise ship for some weeks or months. I don't even know how long it took them to go from New Orleans to effectively Europe. But they're never detected. A plague or some kind of sickness washes its way over the ship during the course of their journey, and somehow they're not detected. I thought it stretched the limits of, what shall I say, credulity a little bit too hard. But they kind of hand wave over the whole thing of them just sort of like living in their cabin and never coming out in the daytime. And just a lot of people just suddenly get sick and die over the course of the trip. So I don't know if there's much else to be said about it, but that was as exciting as the boat ride got, as far as I can recall. Am I missing anything on that score, Leonora?
Well, no. Basically, it's just they keep talking about if Lestat is really dead, what would we should have done, instead of to be like to ensure that Lestat was like really dead. And
yeah, it reminded me of like what we were talking about last week of like going back. It almost felt like, I guess, Anne Rice almost like double thinking her own plotting. Like, should we really have left him in the swamp? Maybe we should have done this, or like, wouldn't it be better if we had like chopped off his head? Or are we sure he's dead? I mean, could he survive? And I'm like, well, okay, yeah, hindsight's 20/20, sure. But you're the one, Claudia, who before all this spent years reading vampire lore across the world.
Yeah.
And it was your idea and your plan to poison him, just cut his throat, and then dump him in a swamp. So I wasn't quite sure how to interpret that other than, is Claudia just an idiot? Or
Yes.
it's just I mean it's like it kind of felt like both the character and Anne Rice was second guessing their own thinking on the subject. And it felt more, because I mean you have a character who's at this point, what, 100 some odd plus years old, who's far more wise and intuitive than your average bear. She's also a born predator, and she's been doing all this research, and that's the best she can come up with. And then they're on the boat going like, oh, what if it didn't work? We could have done it better. Like, yeah, you could have. And any thinking individual would. I mean, the problem is it wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't like, you know, Claudia and Lestat were just kind of sitting there one day and Lestat says, "Ooh, you smell funny." And then Claudia just goes nuts. She's been planning this for some period of time, and that's the best she came up with. I don't know. So it just kind of reinforces to me that, yeah, the whole Lestat killing thing really didn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense, both in the moment and obviously after the fact. But but other than second guessing themselves, I think the boat ride was otherwise uneventful, except for being a little angsty.
Yeah, I don't think that she has like all the answers, or that she didn't do her research properly, because the first time was the swamp, and this time, well, it was the fire. So we need to see if the fire works or not. But or like, because the other theory was, are we really I forgot the word. Immortal, yeah. So because that's the other possibility, you know, like at this point they don't have anything for certain, so maybe they are really immortal, and it's just like legends of how you could kill a vampire.
Except that the thing is that instinctually they know the sun is the most dangerous thing, which is the part that's the thing. It's like, okay, well, if nothing else, and I know we're going backwards to last week, but still, it just keeps sticking in my mind. If nothing else, if you know that you have injured Lestat to the point where he's not going anywhere because now he's like this desiccated husk kind of thing, why not just leave him in the living room with the blinds open during the course of the day and just see what happens? You know, just anyway, that we're relitigating old stuff. But of course, this chapter kind of did too, so that's why we're talking about it. Anyway, so they go on their boat ride and are miraculously not detected or suspected of anything, even though they never come out of their cabin during the day, and people keep getting sick and that kind of thing. Sick and dying.
Because they don't want to get infected with the plague.
Right. They're locking down, as it were. Eventually, they arrive in Europe, and my internal mental sense of geography is kind of off, but I'm not quite sure how. I suppose they had to have sailed from New Orleans over the Atlantic through the Baltic Sea and the Mediterranean, I guess. I mean, and then off into Eastern Europe, because that was their first destination, is to go to Varna, which is, I guess, some sort of suburb of Transylvania. They're the Carpathians. And so they get a very fancy carriage, which I guess Louis is driving, or I wasn't quite sure, like, did they hire a guy to drive them, or they just got a really nice carriage that Louis is driving? I suppose Louis is driving it.
Yeah, that's what I understood that he was driving.
Yeah. So he got some really fancy carriage because Claudia wanted a really fancy carriage, and so they're horse riding their carriage through the back roads of the Carpathians. And something they find out really quick, which, again, you'd think that with all of the research, time, and otherwise, and thinking they would have had before this, they might have considered going through tiny little isolated villages and being vampires isn't as safe a prospect as being in a crowded metropolis, effectively like New Orleans, that is filled with underhanded doings and disease and stuff that can kind of explain the occasional dead body. Whereas in like really cloistered, everybody knows each other tiny villages, somebody going missing, a body being found, that's like a once in a blue moon kind of event. And if you're the newcomer that nobody knows, but that's what they ran into. Like, you guys didn't plan this very well, did you? That's what I kept thinking every time they started, like, oh, well, yeah, that does make things more complicated. Like, yeah, it would, wouldn't it? So.
Yeah, the part of well, this is something that I had like conflicts with through all this part, that I felt like the nights were like, like 20 hours long, and the days were like 3 hours or something like that, because it just doesn't adjust to when they should be, like sleeping or in their coffins, or when they should be outside. And there's just this part when it even feels like they are doing things in plain daylight. And I was really confused with that part. Yeah, I don't think that this time is really well constructed in this part.
Yeah, the part, there's an element to most vampire lore that's missing from our characters, especially in this instance, and that is servants. That is having a thrall. Like even Dracula had a Renfield or a Harker briefly, that kind of thing. It really helps to have a daytime servant. In Vampire the Masquerade, they would be called ghouls. Those are just like regular human beings who have been fed vampire blood and then become effectively sort of psychological, mystical slaves of the vampire, who then serve them during the course of the daytime and other things that they can do, because they're still human. They're not affected by sunlight. But yeah, they've got no helpers. They're just on their own without any other support. So you're trying to imagine how this is working. They're in a carriage, a really fancy carriage, and they're going from town to town, and they apparently have their coffins in the back or something. And then, yeah, so at least half of the time that they're on the road or more, they have to be hidden away somewhere with no security, no oversight, in a place where everybody's superstitious in the first place. If anyone came across a unpopulated carriage with two coffins in the back sitting in some barn somewhere, it would be an immediate, like, everybody in torches and pitchforks. So this entire thing just didn't feel right. They really needed, Anne Rice really should have established a servant or two that they recruited or somehow hypnotized or whatever, paid off, something. But she didn't, and so we're trying to imagine a 5-year-old sized child and a grown man who are both undead, bloodthirsty monsters, making their way across miles and miles of open farmland and rural territory with tiny little villages filled with people who are just brimming over with superstition and fear of anything from the outside. And they just made an okay time of it up until they get to this one village, which we'll talk about in a second. That was just, mind blown.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird how it is constructed, and how, because in the part when we first meet the English couple, is they get to this I don't know, it's like a hostel or whatever, and one of the first things that they ask is, where can I put my coffin? They ask for a room, and they ask for help to put the coffins in their room. So that's something that doesn't make any sense.
And especially when they walk in and everything, and garlic is hung everywhere.
Exactly.
And they're carrying crucifixes, and they're like, okay, so let me back up a little bit. So after a very hand-wavy sort of description of Louis and Claudia's journey across the countryside, they finally end up in this little village at night, of course, and they go to, like Leonora said, sort of a hostel or inn or hotel or motel or whatever it was. and they show up and they just want to like stay for the night, but something's been going on before they got there. Something really that's got everybody all keyed up, and this whole hostel's filled with people. Like she talks about how there's just like people that's crammed into this place. And they're all looking very scared and worried and everything. And the walls are hanging with garlic, and there's a lady holding a cross. And Claudia and Louis are aware of the myths and the legends about what keeps away evil spirits and vampires, even though this doesn't actually work in real life, but they understand these people are already suspicious, and it's obvious that they think there are vampires about. And even though our two characters are ageless, pale-skinned, dim-eyed individuals coming out of the darkness, out of nowhere, all fancy and with foreign accents and speaking different languages, and they've got two coffins in the back, they let them in with a whole bunch of people in there that are just like, and why all these people are crowded in there, I never really understood. But anyway, somehow, some way, Louis like, excuse me, ma'am, what's going on? And then she leads him to like this basement room where there's a guy, a well-dressed, sort of aristocratic kind of guy. I think he's an Englishman, right?
Yeah.
Sitting there next to the body of a woman. And we find out that his name is Morgan, and the woman was Emily. And Emily, after some finagling, we find out she has a giant bite on her neck, and she's dead. She's like dead. And then we get this long, bizarre, drawn-out heart-to-heart between Morgan and this fellow aristocrat who he just met, and he's talking to him like he's his best friend, and they have this long story, and Louis trying to coax this story out of him while there's a whole bunch of vampire scared people upstairs with garlic and crosses and probably weapons if they needed them, and Louis is downstairs talking to Morgan like, so what happened to you, sir? What good sir, what happened to you? What happened to your lady here? I can see why this was cut out for the movie, because it's absolutely bug nut. It makes absolutely, you would have to abandon all of your critical thinking skills, not just in the basis of fantasy, but just in like, okay, I accept that vampires exist. For the sake of this universe, vampires exist. Obviously, the people upstairs think they exist.
Yeah.
What vampire who's lived for hundreds of years at this point would think, do I go into the hotel that has garlic hanging around everywhere and someone carrying a cross? Or do I say, excuse me, can you tell me how far it is to the next village and go on my way?
Yeah.
Like putting myself in danger. It's just, yeah. Anyway, but also, is there a place I can put my coffins?
Yeah, I don't think that Anne Rice goes into depth about it, but I think that the reason that they stayed basically was, timing probably is what it was going to be like. It was going to be day in a short time that probably it wouldn't get anywhere before sunlight.
Well, until we get to later in this chapter, but yeah, okay.
And that they still want to know if there's some information about vampires, because when Morgan and Louis are talking, I feel like Louis is trying to get more information about like the vampire stuff, not necessarily to know about Morgan's life and all his misfortunes, but mostly like what do you think happened here, and who do you think did this? And it's more inquisitive about what happened in order to know more about if there are some vampires over there that they can go meet.
Yeah, I guess. Okay, backing up, I guess, yeah, the entire purpose of this trip was to go find other vampires to learn more about where they came from and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I suppose they would see this as an opportunity to learn something, and especially from somebody who's not a local, who has maybe a bit more of a non-superstitious perspective on it. But at the same time, I thought even that amount of curiosity completely overrides your reason in deciding to stay there. I mean, couldn't you come back the next night maybe just as customers or something? Like, does it have to be this place tonight that you find your haven?
Yeah.
Right now, it's just anyway. So he has this long, drawn-out conversation with Morgan about how Emily and him came to this part of the country and they were on just like a vacation or something. I forget exactly. And they witnessed all this crazy stuff, which will
their honeymoon. Oddly, it was their honeymoon.
Yeah, that's right. There was their honeymoon, and it's weird because the story that Morgan tells is only part of the story. We learn the other part later. We'll get to that. But anyway, so he tells Louis about how they came on their honeymoon and they came to this village. And then Emily was attacked in the night by this monster or whatever. And now she's dead. And all the people in the village have all freaked out. And now they're all huddling around waiting for something to happen. And he's just so forlorn, doesn't know what to do. And thank goodness you came along, Louis. Thank goodness. Oh my gosh, you're my savior. You can help me. I don't know why he thinks that, but I guess he's just, sort of psycho and anything. He says, oh, but the monster, it was up there at that monastery at the top of the hill, off there in the distance. And this getting to that part takes a long time. And then, so after having come to this village, because they need to find a place to stay for the day, after spending God knows how much time talking to Morgan in the basement, it is then decided now is a good time to go marching up into the darkness towards that monastery at the top of the hill to find this monster. Because, daylight's coming, but monster. Yeah. So Louis and Claudia, in their Sunday finest, I guess, go hiking up the hill in the dark.
The 5-year-old.
Yeah, the 5-year-old, right? Remember, you have all these superstitious people who are getting ready for, like, they're all huddled in there. They're waiting for something terrible to happen. They think that the body in the basement is something terrible itself. And it's like, well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your hospitality. Can you watch my coffins while we go up the hill to the monastery all by ourselves in the dark? I go, okay, sure. Okay, and so look, I really feel like, here's the thing. As I'm talking about this, I feel like I'm describing the events of some Disney Plus show I watched that was terrible. Where it's just like the writing and the logic and the character actions are just totally like bonkers. Yeah. Anyway, so Louis and the 5-year-old in her dress decide to march up a grassy hill or something in the middle of the night in the Carpathians up to a monastery because they heard there's a murdering monster up there. Sounds like a good time for the family. Anyway, so they go up there and they're walking around, they're sniffing around everything, and all of a sudden, a lumbering figure starts coming towards them with a body over its shoulder. Lumber, 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 lumber. And then it sees them and it has long black hair, and then Louis tries to approach this thing, and then it's like, and they start fighting, and Louis sees that the face is just, there's no nose and there's no life in the eyes, and it's like, it's basically a corpse that walks with vampire fangs and drops the body on the ground. They fight, and then he and Claudia eventually smash this thing's head open, and it's dead, I guess.
Yeah.
And so what we have here is zompires. I'm going to call them zompires.
Exactly.
Yeah, we have zombie vampires. Didn't talk. It didn't show any signs of intelligence. It was just it really felt like, Frankenstein meets Dracula, and Dracula turns Frankenstein into a vampire. That's what it is. So they kill the only other vampire they've met so far, aside from Lestat and the musician, I suppose. And then the body on the ground, it's Morgan! Because, I guess... Why not? Yeah, so they decide to go up to the monastery, and then the monster just happened to find Morgan, who also decided to go up to the monastery because reasons. I didn't really catch that part. And now Morgan is like, oh my God, you saved me from the monster, you hero, you Louis. And then Morgan decides to tell the other part of the story. That's when it makes sense to tell the other part of the story, that he and Emily, before she got attacked and died, and that he was all like worried that Emily was going to be turned into a vampire. And Louis's like, trust me, she's not going to turn into a vampire. How Louis would know that? Who cares? Anyway, so Morgan and Emily witnessed a scene at a cemetery not too far away or in the same village. I was kind of fuzzy on that part, where the villagers were bringing a horse around to different graves at this cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
And the horse reacted badly at a particular grave, and it was almost like water divination or something, trying to find the evil or something. So this horse gets all skittish at this one grave, and then this woman, who I guess was the family member, is like crying and sobbing, oh my gosh, and the grave is of a lady who died 6 months ago. And so immediately the villagers, trusting the horse sense, dig up this grave, and they crack open the coffin, and there lies the lady, the body of the lady, but she looks pink and healthy, and but she's been 6 months dead. Oh my God, she's a vampire. And so they drive a stake through her heart.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what Morgan and Emily witnesses. And oh my gosh, these people, there's vampires everywhere. Can you believe it? A plague of vampires. And then things become really fuzzy, because this is something that before the show, Leonora and I discussed something. Go over it like you went over it with me before we started. What did you say to make sure we had something to talk about beforehand?
Well, the only thing is that I said that I needed to ask you a question, because I didn't know if it was like the medication I'm on that made like part of the story a little bit confusing, or it was really confusing, because from this part on, they start like I feel like all the stories start like mixing up. There's even one part that I don't even know if we are talking about Emily, or we're talking about Claudia, or we're talking about Morgan, because it's so confusing and overlapped, like
Yes.
all the actions of or everything, that I didn't know if we were like in the present or it was telling the story again. So I got super confused, and I even like read it like 2 or 3 times to just be, like certain that I was getting it, but I did not. So I just, blamed the meds and moved on.
Yeah.
Basically.
Now there's for those of you that are following along, there's a final section in part 2 before part 3 begins, obviously. But it is the pages just before that last section, like the 3 or 4 pages before that, are just jam-packed with words. That is as literary analysis as I'm going to give it, because it is just gobbledygook. It is just mixed together words and images and thoughts from Louis about a million different things at once. And like Leonora, I reread sections a couple of times trying to figure out, what is this? It's not just like, oh, too much vocabulary for my mind to handle or something. It's like, I had no idea what was going on, what Louis was talking about, what he was referring to, who he was referring to, anything. Exactly. It's just absolutely incoherent. And like if I was doing a TEDx, this would be word salad, but the whole square would be filled in, because it's just sentence after sentence, giant paragraph after paragraph, page after page of just stuff.
Uh-huh.
And so, so they save Morgan from the monster, but then, of course, Louis, he gets hungry, and so he bites into Morgan and kills him. Because, that has to happen, because why not? I mean,
Because hungry.
Because hungry, and because there's no sentimentality here at this point. And even, I think even like, wasn't there some commentary in there by him how he generally didn't feed off of people he knew or got to know in some way?
I don't know if I got confused about that too, but I think Claudia is the one that does it, like that kills him. And
maybe that's it. Yeah, that's it. You're right.
But she doesn't kill him.
Right, and then she says, "Go back, Louis." Yeah, right.
And he no, because I have some type of affection towards him. So
right, that's what it is. Yeah, and he talked about Babette at that
I will
time
eat a
too.
rat.
Right. Right. That was it. Yeah. So I got mixed up. Yeah. Claudia bit him, left him almost dead, enough for Louis to go back and get a taste. And he decides not to. And he, like I said, at some point he even references, I think, Babette with having this sort of like inability to feed off of someone he's come to know.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's fed and killed so many people, but they were all strangers. They were just things. But once he gets to know a person or gets to know their story, then he has some kind of like moral, sentimental block that he just can't do it. And yeah, and then they go off, and I guess they go back to the hotel and they sleep in their coffins, and nothing else happens to them. And
no, because they come back as heroes.
Oh, right, because they killed the monster. That's right, yeah.
Yeah, because they now are Louis and Claudia vampire hunters.
God, this is stupid. This is like that one worst episode in a TV series you're watching, and you're just like, this made no sense.
Episode.
What was this episode written by someone who was not involved with the other writing of the other episodes? Because it just I haven't started part 3 yet, but I'll bet you dollars to donuts you could cut out part 2 entirely from the book, and you probably have lost nothing.
Except for
the fact the only interesting thing, and I'll be curious to see if they carry this through the rest of the book or even mention it in the other books. The only interesting thing is the extra lore now on vampires. So there is a theory. When they're talking about it after the fact, there's a theory that, like, why was that vampire so much different than us? Why was it a zombie? And in fact, he mentions how over the course of their travels, that's the only kind of vampire they found, was these kind of soulless zombie vampires.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the theories they put forward, the interviewer at one point asked him, like, why were they so different? And Louis says, well, I have several theories on that. And then he goes on, doesn't talk about it. But the only theory they talk about is that perhaps something different happens to someone if they're turned, but then buried. And then they have to claw their way out of the grave. And that somehow changes their mentality, their spirit, their connection to it or something. And that, again, to be a real nerd for a second, that also reminds me of certain lore within Vampire the Masquerade, where the two major factions in that setting are the Camarilla and the Sabbat. And the Sabbat are the quote-unquote bad guys, and how they initiate or create vampires in their rituals and things is to basically turn somebody into a vampire, and just as they're turning, they smack them over the head with a shovel into a grave that they've already dug for them, bury them alive, and then they have to claw their way out. It's kind of a Darwinian survival of the fittest thing. Like, if they don't come out of the ground, then they weren't meant to become part of our cult, essentially. And if they do, at that point, the idea is that the realization that they're dead, they're now clawing their way out of the earth, and they realize what's happened to them, it helps to separate them from their humanity, because the Sabbat in the Vampire the Masquerade try to get away from thinking of themselves as humans and think of themselves as, like, gods and superior beings and things. So when I read that little theory of how these zombie vampires might come to be, I thought to myself, maybe that's where that came from, or maybe that's what inspired that. But anyway, so now we have a taxonomy of vampires in this setting, where we have the intelligent, the functional, the coherent vampires like Lestat, Louis, and Claudia. And then we have zompires, which for whatever reason are a separate breed that so far only exist in the Eastern Europe Carpathians kind of thing. And so, like I say, I'll be curious to see if that separate species or whatever is brought up at any point later in the book or in the series, or if that is given some more explanation. But that was the only other interesting thing that came out of part 2. Everything else made almost no sense logically and was just a bunch of filler.
Yeah, but tell me one thing.
What's that?
Do you think that we really had to suffer this part 2 just to get a little bit more in-depth information? Don't you think that that she could like just put it somewhere else?
I think that there could have been a much more economical way of telling this story, this part of the story, and still get across that part and make it interesting. I think that I think she could have done it in a way that didn't bring up so many questions. Like in so many other instances, she doesn't have a problem. I'm talking about Anne Rice. She doesn't have a problem in sort of hand waving events and just letting your imagination fill in the gaps without getting too specific. It's not until we get to this point where we start getting specifics of them moving to this village and that all the questions come up. So I think you could have had Louis. And this is also where sort of like the idea that we're listening to someone tell a story in a room kind of breaks down when it gets this detailed and this wordy, because that kind of breaks the whole idea that we're sort of hearing a narrative from someone. You could have said something like, Claudia and I kept our ears to the ground across every village we traveled to and every inn we stopped. He even mentions that at some point, that he would sit there with her on his lap and at a pub or something and just ask about the local folklore and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And if we could have avoided all of this, if he said something like, and at one of these inns, we heard tell that a creature haunted the monastery at the top of this hill. And they could have had this whole adventure where they go up to the monastery. It's all creepy and they're lurking around everything. And then they see this guy come at them. And the whole thing plays out exactly as it was, except that the guy that he drops to the ground just happens to be Morgan. And then Morgan tells his story. And then everything happens exactly the same, except we don't have the inn. We don't have the garlic. We don't have the villagers. We don't have all that nonsense. And then he just moves on from that with the theory about it could have taken all of like 15 pages or something.
I don't think that we even needed the Morgan story, to be honest.
I think having somebody, I think there was utility to having somebody who wasn't a local, giving them their perspective absent all the superstition and folklore of the area. I think there was something useful in that sense. So whether Morgan was there with the monster vampire or not, or maybe they found him somewhere else, maybe I think that story about the villagers going up and like finding the body and staking it and all that. I still think that would have been interesting. A little piece of information.
Spud. You can skip part 2. Yes, you can do it. Do it.
Basically, yes. Usually, yeah. Was it Spud Gun? Yes, you can skip part 2. The only if you're reading the book, the only thing you need to know about part 2 is that there is a type of vampire that so far we've only seen in Eastern Europe who are effectively just mindless zombie vampires who at least have enough intelligence to hunt and hide for the day and everything else, but are otherwise just monsters. And we don't have any kind of explanation yet as to why they operate or are the way they are versus the vampires we've seen so far. I was kind of upset, though, when at some point in here, when they're talking about the fact that these vampires are so different from the only other ones we've seen, like Lestat. I'm like, what about the musician? Why do you keep forgetting the musician? I for some reason, I'm like a musician fanboy now. I want the musician to have a story.
That's the best character ever.
Yeah, best character ever. Best character ever. Had about 5 seconds worth of screen time, but this really is like watching a TV show at this point. But anyway, so that was part 2 in Interview with the Vampire. Any other thoughts, Leonora, before we start wrapping things up?
No, just skip part 2. It's really unnecessary. Well, I say this now. I don't know if maybe in part 3 it becomes like part 2 super relevant. Yeah. Because I don't remember very well like what happens next, but I am pretty sure it's not very important in the future. But we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, my sort of like lore sick mind wants to know more about these zombie vampires at this point, because they weren't a part of the movie. They weren't a part of any of the movies. And I don't know if they're brought up in the new TV series or not, but I always find that kind of stuff interesting because it adds more mysteries, and I like to learn more about that if they go into it. But other than that, it was kind of a it was a part in the story that kind of disappointed me as I read it because it didn't seem like our author knew what the heck she was doing with this part. In all honesty, as I read it and as I got to the end of it, I thought to myself, this feels like something that is still a draft. There is so much glut. There is so much messiness to this entire part. It could have done with another revision, another edit or something, because it really, you could get across all the interesting parts about that section of the book in a much more economical way and without so much confusing clutter. But yeah, so there you go. Let's see. Spudgun, thank you both for the stream. Will you do other book reviews after this? I don't know, as the cops close in on me in the distance. We'll see how, this was just an experiment in the first place to do this stream, and I goaded Leonora into doing it with me. She's never done a live streaming before. This is her first foray into that. I guess we'll decide after we're done with this book if we're going to continue on with the next book and onward and onward. So we'll make that decision then, I suppose. But I guess just since we're kind of halfway through the book, or a little bit more than halfway, how are you enjoying your live streaming experience so far, Leonora?
I am enjoying it. I'm having a really good time. And yeah, if you are up for it, I can do more. Sure. Okay.
Well, then, so for next week, let me take a look here real quick. I think we'll go back to the sections arrangement. I don't know how many. There are only 3 parts in this book, right? I think. Pretty sure. Okay, well, I'll have to flip through and try to count out, like, how many pages or something we're going to do for the next one, because I think we can finish this up within 2 more shows. If we're economical about it. Okay, so anyway, well, I'll post that at some other point. So before we go, though, let's take a look at what you guys had to say, just to make sure I don't leave anything out. Let's see. Asan, I'm late.
Yes, you're late.
Does that mean you're pregnant? Useless Cook. It's kind of like she pulled a George Lucas. I mean... Again, I just, they're like, everything up to this point in the book, I mean, sometimes she got really wordy and sometimes things kind of drifted off into different places, but you're kind of like, okay, well, it's setting things up, it's building a world, you're kind of getting into the mind of Louis, and some details don't make a lot of sense or don't seem to fit. But yeah, part 2 in its entirety, save for like 2 or 3 points, just felt completely out of place. It just felt like I was reading a completely different author and a completely different book, because it was just, yeah. And all of our sort of critiques of the assassination game from the chapters previous really came into focus in this part, where just the sense of time and activity and, like, in the movie, and I don't know if this is in the book or not, in the movie, when they finally find the vampires at the Paris theater, they have that little boy that helps them, that they feed from, that's got all the bite marks all over him.
Yes.
Okay. When they had to escape from the theater, who's driving the carriage? Well, the little boy, because he's human. And so the sun's coming up. And so it just, this is the part that, again, I'll come back to it, I'm sure. You're telling me that after hundreds of years of living as a vampire, the utility of having a thrall, a servant, some kind of blood slave or something to protect you during the daytime, or to have at your beck and call or something, never occurred to these guys? It just never came up? I don't know. I could go on about that, but I'd be taking forever. Spudgun, I think it works. You both have a good chemistry, but I hope you get well soon, Leonora.
Oh, I hope that too. Thank you very much.
Yeah, she's been with the sickness for a couple of days now.
Yeah.
Let's see. And I think we're going to call it there, guys. About 45 minutes is about our time for these things. So thank you guys for joining us. If you'd like to read ahead, I'll just say in rough terms, we're going to read the next 5 sections of the book into part 3. I don't know exactly how much that makes up, but I guess we'll find out as we go. Yeah, we'll pick a stopping point somewhere about halfway through the remainder of the book, and then we'll finish up the last part probably the week after. For those of you listening in the future, if you have any comments on what we've said about the book or any other insight, don't give us any spoilers necessarily, because, you know, I'd like to still be surprised, but leave comments below. If you liked this kind of thing, please leave a like on the way out. If you didn't like it, you can leave a dislike. I appreciate your engagement either way. But yeah, we'll do this again next Sunday at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern for part 5 of Book Review of the Vampire. And also, everyone, just a reminder at the top of the chat box, the fundraiser for Twisted Skipster's friend Tracy. Please take a look at that if you would. But everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Moderators, thank you for keeping an eye on things. Even though everyone here is so well behaved, you have very, very little to do. Everybody who donated, either to myself or to the fundraiser, thank you so much for your generosity. Leonora, thank you for joining me, as always.
Thank you. Thank you guys for listening.
Yep. Everyone, have a good rest of your Sunday and your weekend. Hope the week ahead of you treats you well. I hope you're all safe and well. If you're not well, Leonora, please get well soon.
Thank you.
And we'll see you guys on the next one. Bye-bye.
Bye.